Donald Trump has aggressively rolled back much of the environmental protections that were accomplished in previous administrations. But it turns out that the federal government isn't necessarily full of profit-driven climate deniers. A total of 13 federal agencies just released a major scientific report acknowledging the severity of global warming. The report argues that climate change will knock as much as 10% off the size of the American economy by the end of this century. To give you a sense of how disastrous that is, the economic damage of climate change would be double the losses of the Great Recession a decade ago. According to the New York Times, the assessment lays out the devastating effects of a changing climate on the record wildfires in California, crop failures in the Midwest, and crumbling infrastructure in the South. The same report also finds that American exports and supply chains could be disrupted, agricultural yields could fall to 1980s levels by mid-century, and fire season could soon spread to the southeast. Something that I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemies, by the way. Perhaps the most compelling element of this report is how these federal agencies cited astronomical costs to really highlight the financial toll of climate change inaction and denial. PBS NewsHour has some of those details.
The continental United States is already 1.8 degrees warmer than it was a century ago, and the temperature may rise by another 2.3 degrees by 2050. Unless more is done, the risks and impact of climate change are expected to shrink the U.S. economy 10% by century's end. David Easterling of NOAA, which released the report, suggested in a media call that climate change would damage the country's infrastructure, economy, and human health.
If we do absolutely nothing to get carbon emissions under control, we could be suffering some of the most outrageous costs related to climate change by the end of the century. That includes $141 billion from heat-related deaths, $118 billion from sea level rise, and $32 billion from infrastructure damage. Every 4 years, the federal government is now required by law to issue the National Climate Assessment. The previous report was issued in 2014 and found that climate change would eventually lead to water scarcity in dry regions, like California, torrential downpours in wet regions, and more severe heat waves and wildfires. Luckily, the whole point of these federal reports is to find solutions to very real and devastating problems. For instance, as the result of the 2014 report, the EPA, under the Obama administration, imposed landmark climate regulations known as the Clean Power Plan. These regulations aim to cut carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants. Obama also played a leadership role in negotiating the Paris Agreement, the same agreement that Trump pulled out of at the beginning of his presidency. Look, to be clear, I don't believe that Obama did enough to mitigate the impact of climate change. But if you thought he didn't do enough, just wait till you hear the Trump administration's non-solutions or approach to this problem. The recent federal report suggests the government put forth three main solutions: imposing taxes or fees on companies that release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, establishing government regulations on how much greenhouse pollution can be emitted, and spending public money on clean energy research. But all of those solutions are unlikely to come to fruition with the Trump administration in office. In fact, the White House issued a statement in response to the latest report, alleging that the findings are, quote, largely based on the most extreme scenario of global warming, and that the next assessment would provide an opportunity for greater balance. In other words, the administration plans on censoring or diluting the results of future climate change studies to fit their fossil fuel-loving, profit-driven narrative. Maybe the next report will specifically blame California's worsening wildfires on the lack of raking. Over the weekend, Trump even attempted to provide evidence that climate change isn't real. Of course, all he did was embarrass himself by giving us yet another example of how unbearably ignorant he is. It's been cold on the East Coast, and Trump used that as an opportunity to claim that brutal and extended cold blast could shatter all records. Whatever happened to global warming? Don't you wish we had a president who was actually smarter than us? I really miss that. Most of us know, because we have enough brain cells to comprehend simple concepts, that weather and climate are two different things. Weather notes the conditions of the atmosphere over a short period of time, and climate is how the atmosphere behaves over a relatively long period of time. So using an example of a cold day or two to disprove climate change makes you look like an idiot. Kind of like when Senator James Inhofe did this.
In case we have forgotten, because we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record, I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball. And that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
I love that he ended that with a as if he had just made a great point. Yeah, you really killed it, Senator Inhofe. Unfortunately, we're paying the consequences of having these dum-dums as our political leaders. Trump has already taken destructive actions against our environment, and there's no end to how far he'll go to help his fossil fuel buddies make money at our expense. In March of last year, Trump was abundantly clear about what his priorities are.
With today's executive action, I am taking historic steps to lift the restrictions on American energy, to reverse government intrusion, and to cancel job-killing regulations. First, today's energy independence action calls for an immediate reevaluation of the so-called Clean Power Plan. Perhaps no single regulation threatens our miners, energy workers, and companies more than this crushing attack on American industry. Second, we are lifting the ban on federal leasing for coal production.
Why does he always sound like he's struggling when he says industry? Industry. It sounds like he's sounding it out as he's trying to read a difficult word. Anyway, oddly enough, the American people seem to disagree with Trump's take on climate change, which has been evidenced through various surveys and polls.
Yale University and George Mason University find that 7 in 10 Americans acknowledge climate change is happening. And a majority say correctly that humans are largely responsible for warming the planet. Trump has denied these simple facts.
Nobody really knows.
And he's expressed both skepticism and disdain for possible fixes to global warming, from the Paris Agreement on climate change to Barack Obama's Clean Power Plan. But the researchers find Americans actually favor these and other fixes. 69% say the U.S. should be a part of the Paris Agreement, which aims to green the world economy. And nearly 80% of Americans surveyed say they support taxing and or regulating global warming pollution.
Studies that show the impact of climate change are worthless unless we fight back against politicians who are in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry. Americans need to get involved. We need to vote destructive and corrupt politicians out of office. We need to get money out of politics so the Koch brothers don't have more sway than the average American people when it comes to our electoral system. And we need to apply pressure to the political figures who are currently in charge so they actually do something to represent our best interests. Our economy and our lives depend on it.